Under Operations, none submitted. Finance Budget Report. Administration will update the board on fiscal year 2018 budget development. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you for coming again.
Good evening.
Know a little bit more now.
Yes. In fact, I wish I had a real-time budget presentation because just in the last 20 minutes we have new information to share. So already my PowerPoint is just slightly outdated, but we're going to roll with it. Well, good evening, President Logan, Assistant or Dr. Thompson, Superintendent, if I get the right title. It's so confusing. Things are moving so fast. So let's just fire right on into the legislative update. And I'm going to refer to my notes since this literally just came in. So the legislature did adjourn, and it had a very tough job. I mean, there's no doubt it had a very, very tough job. And in the last few weeks of the session, they were able to pass Senate Bill 19, which was the school finance formula. They overrode the governor's veto of a tax bill, and they passed a budget bill. So a lot of activity there at the end of the session. And then last week, the governor signed the school finance bill, which moved it right into the Supreme Court's purview. And just in the last 20 minutes, we did receive some information that the court has scheduled briefs by both parties to be simultaneously submitted no later than June 30th. So that's pretty fast. The briefs, replies to those briefs are due by July 7th, and oral arguments have been set in Topeka for 9 a.m. on July 18th. So that's kind of the calendar now as far as what the Supreme Court will hear and their timeline, and ultimately we'll see what happens then after July 18th as far as the next step in the process. The other piece that they did clarify, both sides in this case did request that after June 30th that Senate Bill 19 go into effect for schools so that business can be conducted, and the court agreed. So as of July 1st, we are able to conduct business under the new formula as if it were adopted and in law until the court would make a decision on its constitutionality. So that's good news. It gives the district some assurances on how to move forward past that sunset date of June 30 for the old block grant. So kind of taking those additional dates, we know that June 26th is a sine die session. I don't see a whole lot of impact at that session for districts. June 30th, the block grant sunsets, but now we know that as of July 1st, the new formula will go into effect. Supreme Court will hear the oral arguments. The Supreme Court will issue a decision. And then the new date I've started to put on, just to kind of keep it in reference, is that at this point, August 25th are the date that budgets are due. Of course, school starting August 23rd, there's a lot of considerations as we move through the process, a lot of action to come. So certainly the court will be looking at, is the bill adequate? A reminder that Senate Bill 19, year one, for districts across Kansas, it's $194 million of new funding, and then year two, an additional $98 million. After that, it's the Consumer Price Index. Compared to what the State Board of Education has indicated, it would find adequacy at $566 million year one, $327 million year two. So that's, the Senate Bill 19 is only a third of those numbers, and then, of course, the trial court and the cost studies beyond that. So I thought tonight we'd look a little bit more at the formula itself, now that especially it's going in 7-1. It has a name. It's called the Kansas School Equity and Enhancement Act. It sets the base aid per student, base aid per pupil, which is now called the Base Aid for Student Excellence, the BASE, B-A-S-E, at $4,006 for 17-18, and then that increases to $4,128 for 18-19, and then those base amounts are increased by the Consumer Price Index for the following 3 years. When it's calculating the base, it will look at enrollment based on the prior year or the second preceding year, whichever is higher. The legislature wanted some stability and able to forecast how much money was going into school finance, and so looking at enrollment either in the previous year or the year before that will help with the budget process for them. So the 4-year-old at risk is the exception to that, and that will be based on current year enrollment. All the weightings will be based on current year enrollment, and we'll talk about weightings here in a minute. The all-day kindergarten will be funded at a 1.0 FTE, which is increased from 0.5. That's a big chunk of the new money that's coming in, is the increase for all-day K. And then the 20 mil levy remains the same. We'll talk a little bit about the at-risk funding. It will continue to be based on the free lunch count. The weighting for at-risk was increased from 0.456 to 0.484. This will raise about $4 million for Wichita. I cannot emphasize enough the change in emphasis on at-risk related to accountability and reporting that's going to be coming down over the next few years. I'm grateful that they gave us a year to kind of wrap our arms around how we proceed. But for 2018 and 19 and subsequent years, districts will be required to use at-risk funds for at-risk education programs and services identified and approved by the Kansas Board of Education as evidence-based best practices, and then districts will be required to submit reporting to the Board of Education concerning those programs and improvements under those programs, with a legislative post-audit to follow in fiscal year 20, and then a legislative review thereafter. So there's recognition at the legislative level that at-risk children require additional resources. They want some accountability if they're going to provide those resources. Are we making progress? Are we moving the needle? So certainly that's going to be an area we're going to spend a lot of time on this next year. A task force has been formed to really look at what we spend at-risk dollars on and where we're going to move on that funding in the future. The other targeted weightings that are essentially very similar to the old school finance formula would include bilingual, high enrollment, high density at risk, career technical education, new school facilities weighting, and virtual. The high density at risk has similar requirements to the regular at risk, and then there's some sunsetting for career and technical ed as they do a cost study to see if that's a sufficient weighting on that particular line item. Special education, the funding remains the same as the current law, but they do intend to contribute more funds to get us closer to the 92% of excess costs. I believe the contribution, at least for Wichita, gets us to 83%, up from 79%. Transportation, there will be some tweaks to this, but generally speaking, no district will lose any transportation funds for the next 4 years. There's a grandfather status in this bill. So we should at least have no less than what we've had in prior year. And then the pre-K program, there is increasing state aid for 4-year-old at-risk programs, and this should be about a 5-year increase at about $2 million a year. So just a real rough estimate for Wichita would be about $200,000. On the local option budget, a district may choose to increase its LOB up to a maximum of 33%. And this used to be by vote. Now it would just be by protest petition. Equalization remains at 81.2%. And right now, 259 is sitting at an LOB that's at 30%. Change on capital outlay. There's language added to allow for capital outlay funds to be used for property casualty insurance and utility expenses. This is similar to the expansion that happened a few years ago when they allowed for computer software. This is very similar. Certainly, this expansion favors high property value districts where 8 mills will raise more money. So this may be viewed as disequalizing. We're just going to have to wait and see what the court has to say on that. I did want to just revisit our slide from a presentation or two ago to remind, as these weightings come back into play, this graph becomes very important in that the way we spend money in classrooms is really broken down by this restricted, unrestricted, and targeted funds. restricted being our federal funds, and then those by statute, special ed. The targeted are our weighted funds. So certainly as we look at new monies coming in, a lot of that stream is at targeted programs. So that's going to be something that we need to keep in mind as we make our plans for the funds coming to us. Open, obviously. I just threw the major budget modifications for the past 8 years up here too. $25 million which is all funds. That's the estimate at this point. Very, very rough estimate. All funds, including the LOB increase for Wichita for 17-18. It's a lot of money, but we've got a big 8-year hole. We didn't cut almost $97 million in a year. We're not going to be able to dig out of our hole in a year. So it's just going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of planning to plan on using those funds in a way that certainly meets the needs of all our areas, but it meets also the criteria of accountability and the changes in this bill that we're going to be held accountable.
Joy has a question.
You flew through that.
Sorry.
So I just had a couple of questions of clarity. When you talked about the accountability piece that the legislature's asking for in reporting changes, they're asking for accountability. The question, they're asking us to prove that we've used the money that way. What is the consequence if a district doesn't use their money? Are there teeth in this law?
There's a little bit of teeth. The possibility of, and the language I think is actually more in the high density at risk, but there is some language in there that if you aren't using the evidence-based best practices and you aren't making sufficient progress, that you could lose a piece of the funding.
So if you're using practices but they're not making strides, you still keep the money, or vice versa.
I think that's
but if
that's
both
the premise.
Are, then you would lose some
right. You would have to
funding.
basically have to come up with why you weren't doing that. I mean, there would have to be some explanation there.
Mm-hmm. I just wondered, because some states have, shut the school down and re-charter it and blah, blah, blah. I just wanted to see how far they went with that. My second question was on the special ed funding. I was a little unclear. You threw out several numbers, 72, 83. Can you help me just real quick where we are and where we think we'll be?
Yes. Right now, we're getting around $44 million in special ed aid from the state. That's 79% of what we should be getting compared to the 92% that's required by statute. Okay. They will put some more money into this, and we're anticipating between $2.5 million in additional funding, which gets us closer to the 92%, but not there yet. So that's going to be probably $46 million in state aid for special ed.
Did you say that puts us at 83%?
Yes.
Okay, so we're still
way under 92.
Okay. And then, okay, and you may have answered this question already, but on capital outlay, the part that was potentially disequalizing, we don't already use capital outlay for utility and property casualty. This law says we could.
That's right. You couldn't today, right. You can't today, but in 2 weeks potentially you could, when the bill goes into effect. For most districts, that's not feasible because there just isn't enough money in capital outlay to cover utilities. But for a few districts that are high property value, they could spend easily utility expenses and property casualty and still be able to maintain their facilities because their 8 mills a raise is a lot more than the lower property value districts.
So if we were to do that next year and then if we hurry, get our budget done, and then the Supreme Court comes back in August and says that piece, we're going to strike that piece, then we'd be back.
Right.
So at this point, it wouldn't be smart to make that change for capital outlay in Wichita, even if, I don't know if we can or not, but it wouldn't be smart if we think it might not pass muster until we know where it's really going to be.
We would eat up a lot of cash flow moving utilities to capital, and we're kind of already behind on all our maintenance projects as it is, so it wouldn't be something I would highly recommend us looking at because we're just now getting ourselves situated where capital funding is at least solid enough to get some projects started in the fall instead of waiting until January, February, March when the property tax payments and state aid comes in. If we hit utilities there, that's going to eat up those fall monies, which means they're again back to delaying all their projects until funds come in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You may go ahead.
Okay. So as far as shutdown planning, obviously the good news is that as of July 1st, we can operate under the new formula. So we are definitely at Tier 1, business as usual. We'll be watching activity at the court level very closely to make sure that we have all the latest information. We can bring you those updates. Certainly nothing's going to happen until well after July 18th, when after oral arguments and a decision potentially gets made one way or the other. If there were to be a special session, it would be sometime after that date. Pushing those deadlines out, it's going to be very tight. So at this point, Tier 1, business as usual, and the good news is we have a formula as of July 1st. So just to recap, there are still many steps to go, but we are making progress in the process, hoping still, keeping our fingers crossed, to finalize the budget before August 25th. The legislature did adopt a structurally sound school finance plan, recognizing kids with highest needs require more support. Questions remain if the funding is actually enough as far as what new money is being added. The court now has begun its review process, and it's business as usual until we have instruction to the contrary. Questions?
Mr. Rogers?
I don't have a lot of questions, but I guess I just wanted to bring the board up. I did not vote for this bill, and while the formula is much better than what we had, and that doesn't take a lot when you compare it to the class program with the non-formula that we've had for the last 2 years. But this is very close to the old formula. But I counted 11 equity violations and 4 adequacy violations. There is a lot of candy for Johnson County in this bill, or for high property value districts. A lot of the rural and urban districts, the only way that they'll see a lot of additional money after this initial year is with increases to their LOB, moving money out of their capital outlay, for insurance and utilities. And as we talked about on the floor, there's the little tiny town of Buckland. They have wanted to replace all their windows in their school, and the senator there, Senator Estes, reminded everybody that it's taken them 3 years because they've had to save up a little bit in their capital outlay to do that. Well, they're not going to be moving money out of their capital outlay into insurance or utilities to do that type of thing. So it is very, very friendly to the Johnson County and to that area, and I think we'll be back in Topeka. Some people think it would be a very short special session. I would hope, but we don't have a really good track record this year on short sessions. But I think the adequacy violations and then the 11 equity violations, one is that we have a 10% floor for at-risk. So if you are a district that has no, or if you don't have a 10% at risk, you can still count up to 10% of your kids at risk. That only affects 2 districts in Johnson County. The high density also got expanded to schools that are extremely poor, not just the district. Before you had to qualify as the district. And then also the false base. When you calculate your LOB, the false base is 4492, and that will never catch, the regular base will never catch up to that because the CPI is going to be applied to both of those. We tried to take that off on the floor as well and couldn't. But again, those were very high priority items for certain high property value districts. So I think we'll see a number of things that will come back. There is some thinking that the courts will give us a pass and say that you did good enough. You can come back and fix it the next year in regular session. I don't anticipate that to be the case, but I assume that will be the case. And then I think I just wanted to add to a little bit on the special ed. There are districts, what'd you say we were at? This would take us to about
83%.
83. There are districts that are upwards of 150% of their costs in special ed. And again, the high, where we have specialized services, those districts, and those do, those are mostly the larger ones or the larger co-ops. They will get a little bit more money, but not as much as those that are already over the excess costs amount. So again, that's going to be something that's very, very unfair. So that's just my 2 cents worth. Again, I think it's better. I'm glad that they're letting us use this right away because, again, on June 30th it was going to go away, and we didn't spare too much time to get it done. So thank you.
I just have one question because about the June 30th date. The new money with the new formula will be prorated based on the first year of the new formula. Is that correct?
We've not seen any direction as far as the funding that's going to come in. All the court has said, and again, this was just in the decision we just received 20 minutes ago, is that the schools can operate under the formula. Didn't really address how, if those state aid payments would come in and if they're coming in timely. We know that first July payment is actually the last June payment, and that will come in around the 7th. And then after that, I think it remains to be seen what will occur.
Because as we build a budget, that's a question that we kind
Yes.
of need an answer for. So will we not, we don't know when.
We
we'll
don't
get the
know.
answer.
We don't know.
Okay. Ms. Arnold?
Actually, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for your presentation, but also thank you for spending time with each of the board members prior to the meetings to step us through this and try to explain the information. That's something that has helped immensely, and I just want to publicly acknowledge that you are continuing in that vein, and it does help us understand a lot, so I appreciate that.
I'm seeing no other questions, so we will look forward to having a few more answers maybe soon. Thank you very much.